There was a time when no one in Europe knew his name. No king feared him, no general admired him, no army marched beneath his command. He owned no palace, no fortune, and no empire. He was simply a quiet young officer with a heavy Corsican accent, standing among hundreds of other soldiers in a nation that had just begun tearing itself apart. Few could have imagined that this unknown lieutenant would one day redraw the map of Europe, overthrow ancient kingdoms, defeat some of history's greatest armies, and crown himself Emperor of the French. Yet perhaps the most extraordinary part of his story is not how he conquered Europe, but how close he came to remaining completely forgotten. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, on the Mediterranean island of Corsica. The timing of his birth could hardly have been more significant. Only a year earlier, Corsica had been conquered by France after centuries of foreign rule. The island was still adjusting to its new rulers. Many Corsicans continued to dream of independence, and French authority remained fragile. Napoleon grew up in a place that was neither fully French nor entirely independent. From the moment he entered the world, he belonged to two identities, never fitting perfectly into either one. His family belonged to the lower ranks of the local nobility. The title sounded impressive. The reality was far less glamorous. The Bonapartes possessed little wealth compared to the great aristocratic families of France. They owned modest property, struggled financially, and relied heavily on scholarships to provide opportunities for their children. Napoleon's father, Carlo Bonaparte, believed that education offered the best path toward success, and despite the family's limited resources, he managed to secure a place for his young son at one of France's military schools. It was an opportunity that would change history. But at the time, it felt more like a punishment. When Napoleon arrived in mainland France as a child, he immediately discovered that he was different from everyone around him. He spoke French awkwardly, with a thick Corsican accent that classmates mocked relentlessly. His surname sounded foreign. His manners reflected island traditions rather than Parisian sophistication. Among the sons of wealthy French nobles, he was an outsider in every possible sense. Children can be remarkably cruel. His classmates laughed at the way he pronounced words. They mocked his accent. They made jokes about Corsica, dismissing it as a poor and insignificant island. Some called him a foreigner. Others treated him as though he did not belong in France at all. Napoleon rarely answered. Instead, he withdrew into silence. While other boys spent their afternoons fencing, socializing, or competing for attention, Napoleon disappeared into libraries. Books became both his refuge and his weapon. He devoured works on mathematics, geography, philosophy, and above all, military history. He became fascinated by men who had changed the world through intelligence rather than birthright. Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Hannibal. These were not simply historical figures to him. They became examples of what one determined individual might accomplish against overwhelming odds. Even as a teenager, Napoleon developed habits that would remain with him throughout his life. He slept little. He studied obsessively. He questioned everything. He filled notes with observations about warfare, politics, and leadership. Teachers noticed that while he struggled socially, he possessed an extraordinary ability to analyze complex problems with remarkable speed. One instructor famously remarked that the young Corsican would someday make his mark on the world. At the time, few believed him. After completing his education, Napoleon joined the French army as a second lieutenant in the artillery. It was not the most glamorous branch of the military. Many ambitious young officers dreamed of commanding cavalry charges or leading infantry across famous battlefields. Napoleon chose artillery. To him, war was not about heroic gestures. It was about mathematics, angles, distance, time, precision. Artillery rewarded intelligence more than noble birth, and Napoleon understood that well-planned cannon fire could decide battles long before soldiers crossed swords. Yet despite his talent, his future seemed painfully ordinary. Promotion within the royal army depended largely upon family connections. Powerful aristocratic families advanced quickly. Poor officers waited. Napoleon had ability. Others had influence. For years, it appeared that influence would win. Then, France exploded. In 1789, the French Revolution began. The storming of the Bastille shattered centuries of royal authority. Across the kingdom, the old order collapsed with astonishing speed. Noble privileges disappeared. Political institutions transformed almost overnight. Many aristocratic officers abandoned France, fearing imprisonment or worse. Suddenly, the French army faced a crisis. Thousands of experienced commanders were gone. Entire chains of command disappeared almost overnight. The revolution desperately needed new officers. For the first time in generations, talent mattered more than family name. The door that had remained closed throughout Napoleon's early career suddenly swung open. Still, opportunities alone do not create legends. Someone must seize them. Napoleon's chance arrived in 1793. The southern port city of Toulon had rebelled against the revolutionary government. Royalist forces had invited the British Royal Navy into the harbor, giving one of France's greatest enemies a powerful foothold on the Mediterranean coast. If Toulon remained under enemy control, the revolution itself could be placed in serious danger. Young Captain Napoleon Bonaparte was assigned to the siege as an artillery officer. Most senior commanders focused on attacking the city directly. Napoleon saw something different. Rather than assaulting heavily defended walls, he carefully studied the surrounding landscape. High hills overlooked the harbor. Whoever controlled those hills controlled the port itself. If French artillery occupied those positions, British ships would no longer be safe. It was an astonishingly simple solution. Yet no one else had fully recognized it. Napoleon relentlessly argued for his plan. Eventually, his commanders agreed. French guns were hauled onto the heights overlooking Toulon. When they finally opened fire, the results were devastating. British warships suddenly found themselves under constant bombardment. Remaining in the harbor became impossible. The Royal Navy withdrew. Without naval protection, the city quickly collapsed. The siege of Toulon ended in victory. Almost overnight, the unknown Corsican officer became one of the revolution's brightest military stars. He was promoted to brigadier general. He was only 24 years old. But fame can disappear as quickly as it arises. Only 2 years later, France once again stood on the edge of disaster. The revolution had entered one of its most unstable periods. Political factions fought one another almost constantly. Royalist supporters believed the revolutionary government had grown weak. In October 1795, thousands of armed insurgents marched toward Paris, hoping to overthrow the government by force. The leaders of the Republic desperately searched for someone willing to defend the capital. They chose Napoleon. The situation appeared hopeless. The attackers outnumbered government forces. If Paris fell, the revolution itself might collapse. Napoleon acted with extraordinary speed. Instead of spreading his soldiers across the city, he concentrated artillery at the most likely avenues of attack. Cannon after cannon was positioned to dominate the narrow streets through which the insurgents would advance. When the royalist forces finally appeared, Napoleon gave a single order. The cannons fired. The devastating blast of grapeshot tore through the advancing columns. Within minutes, the assault collapsed. The rebellion was crushed almost as quickly as it had begun. The violence shocked many observers. But it achieved exactly what Napoleon intended. Paris had been saved. The government survived. And once again, the name Napoleon Bonaparte spread across France. Politicians admired him. Soldiers respected him. Ordinary citizens began hearing stories about the brilliant young general who seemed capable of solving impossible problems. For the government, he had become more than a successful officer. He had become indispensable. Only months later, another extraordinary opportunity arrived. The French army of Italy was considered one of the weakest forces in the Republic. Its soldiers lacked proper food. Their uniforms were worn and patched. Many had not received regular pay for months. Supplies were scarce. Morale was dangerously low. Most politicians viewed the Italian front as little more than a secondary theater of war. Napoleon saw something entirely different. He saw an army waiting for someone to believe in it. When he arrived to take command in early 1796, he stood before thousands of exhausted soldiers and delivered one of the most famous speeches of his career. He acknowledged their suffering. He admitted they were hungry, poorly equipped, forgotten by their government. Then he promised them something they had almost stopped believing existed: victory, rich land, glory, a future beyond endless hardship. Many officers dismissed his confidence as youthful arrogance. The soldiers were not so certain. As they watched their 26-year-old commander standing before them, speaking with absolute conviction despite impossible circumstances, some began to wonder if this quiet Corsican truly saw something they could not. They had no way of knowing it yet. But the forgotten army standing before Napoleon would soon become one of the most feared fighting forces in Europe. And the unknown soldier from Corsica was about to begin his march toward an empire. When Napoleon Bonaparte crossed the Alps in the spring of 1796, few people outside the French army believed he would ever return as one of Europe's greatest generals. The army of Italy was exhausted. Its soldiers wore torn uniforms that barely protected them from the cold mountain winds. Many marched barefoot, wrapping their feet in rags because proper boots had long since fallen apart. Food was scarce. Ammunition had to be rationed. Their cannons were old, their horses were weak, and many officers believed they had been sent to one of the least important fronts of the Revolutionary Wars. Across the mountains waited the armies of Austria and the Kingdom of Sardinia. They were better supplied, better equipped, and far more experienced. On paper, the campaign should have ended in disaster. Napoleon looked at the same situation and reached a completely different conclusion. He understood something that many commanders overlooked. His enemies possessed larger armies, but those armies were divided. If he moved faster than they could communicate, he could defeat each one separately before they had time to unite. It was an idea that sounded almost reckless. Instead of waiting for reinforcements, he attacked immediately. His soldiers marched farther each day than many thought possible. Roads became rivers of mud after spring rains, yet they continued moving. Entire artillery batteries were dragged across steep mountain passes that many believed were impossible for cannons to cross. Napoleon rarely remained in one place for long. He rode constantly between different units, memorizing the terrain, inspecting positions, and speaking directly with his soldiers. The speed of the French advance stunned their enemies. Before Austrian commanders could fully understand where Napoleon intended to strike, he had already defeated one of their allies. Before they reorganized their defenses, another French attack shattered a second position. Every victory seemed to arrive before the previous one had even been reported. It was warfare unlike Europe had seen before. Napoleon refused to fight slow, predictable campaigns. He wanted movement, surprise, momentum. His army became a weapon that never stopped advancing. Within weeks, victories at Montenotte, Lodi, Castiglione, and later Arcole transformed the young general into a legend. Soldiers began speaking about him with something approaching reverence. Stories spread through the camps describing impossible marches, brilliant battlefield decisions, and a commander who somehow always appeared exactly where the fighting was most intense. One battle, however, became especially important: the Battle of Lodi. As Austrian forces retreated across a long wooden bridge over the Adder River, heavy artillery covered every approach. Cannonballs tore through the advancing French columns. Musket fires swept the bridge from one end to the other. Several attacks failed almost immediately. For a moment, the advance stopped. Many commanders might have ordered a retreat. Napoleon did the opposite. According to numerous accounts, he rode toward the front, urging his men forward despite the deadly fire. Whether every detail of the later stories is perfectly accurate remains debated, but what mattered most was how the soldiers remembered it. They believed their general had shared their danger. They believed he had inspired them to cross when retreat seemed the safer choice. The bridge was eventually taken. The Austrians withdrew. And among the French army, something extraordinary happened. Many soldiers began calling Napoleon the Little Corporal. The nickname had nothing to do with his official rank. It reflected affection. They saw him less as a distant aristocrat and more as one of their own, a commander who understood ordinary soldiers because he marched beside them rather than hiding safely behind the battlefield. Over the next 2 years, Napoleon repeatedly defeated armies that many believed should have crushed him. Austria, one of Europe's oldest and strongest monarchies, found itself forced to negotiate with a young French general who only a few years earlier had been an unknown artillery officer. His victories brought enormous wealth back to France. Captured supplies fed his soldiers. Contributions imposed on conquered territories financed future campaigns. Works of art from across Italy were transported to Paris, where revolutionary leaders celebrated Napoleon as the Republic's greatest hero. For the first time in centuries, France was no longer defending itself. France was expanding. Napoleon became a national celebrity. Newspapers praised his victories almost daily. Artists painted dramatic scenes of his campaigns. Politicians admired his success. Ordinary citizens memorized his name. By the age of 28, Napoleon Bonaparte had become the most famous general in France. But he wanted more than military glory. He wanted lasting greatness. In 1798, he proposed one of the boldest military expeditions of the age. Rather than attacking Britain directly, Napoleon suggested striking one of its most valuable strategic connections, Egypt. At first glance, the idea seemed almost unbelievable. Egypt belonged to the Ottoman Empire. It lay thousands of miles from Paris. What possible reason could revolutionary France have for invading North Africa? Napoleon believed the answer was simple. Britain depended heavily upon trade routes leading toward India. If France established itself in Egypt, British influence in the eastern Mediterranean could be weakened dramatically. Perhaps Britain itself could eventually be forced into submission. The expedition that left France was unlike any military campaign Europe had previously witnessed. More than 30,000 soldiers boarded the ships. But they were not alone. Napoleon also invited mathematicians, astronomers, botanists, architects, engineers, artists, historians, linguists. Nearly 200 scholars accompanied the army. Napoleon believed conquest alone was not enough. He wanted knowledge. Where previous conquerors carried only swords, he carried libraries. As the French fleet crossed the Mediterranean, few people realized they were witnessing one of history's first truly scientific military expeditions. The army landed successfully in Egypt. Within weeks, Napoleon marched toward Cairo. Waiting for him were the famous Mamluk cavalry, warriors whose reputation stretched across centuries. Many Europeans believed they were nearly unstoppable. On July 21, 1798, near the ancient pyramids of Giza, Napoleon addressed his troops with words that would become legendary. "Soldier, from the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." Whether those were his exact words or later polished by history hardly matters. The message was unforgettable. His soldiers were not merely fighting another battle. They were making history beneath monuments already ancient when Rome itself was young. The French won decisively. The Mamluk army collapsed. Cairo soon fell. For a brief moment, it appeared that Napoleon had once again achieved the impossible. Then disaster struck. Only days later, the British fleet under Admiral Horatio Nelson discovered the French ships anchored in Aboukir Bay. The Battle of the Nile destroyed most of Napoleon's fleet. Suddenly, the French army found itself trapped in Egypt. There would be no easy return home. The campaign continued for months. French scientists carefully documented Egypt's monuments, temples, wildlife, and geography. Among their greatest discoveries was an ancient slab of black stone found near the town of Rosetta. Covered with the same text written in 3 different scripts, it would later become known as the Rosetta Stone. Years afterward, scholars used it to unlock the meaning of Egyptian hieroglyphs for the first time in nearly 15 centuries. Even in military uncertainty, the expedition transformed humanity's understanding of one of the world's oldest civilizations. Meanwhile, events in France grew increasingly unstable. The revolutionary government known as the Directory had become deeply unpopular. Economic problems worsened. Political corruption spread. Military victories abroad no longer concealed growing dissatisfaction at home. Napoleon recognized an opportunity. Leaving part of his army behind in Egypt, he quietly returned to France in late 1799. Some criticized him for abandoning the campaign. Most citizens hardly cared. To them, Napoleon remained the undefeated hero of Italy. The government that welcomed him was weak, divided, and running out of time. Only weeks after returning, Napoleon joined a carefully planned political coup known as the Coup of 18 Brumaire. Unlike so many revolutions throughout history, this one required surprisingly little bloodshed. There were no enormous battles in the streets, no prolonged civil war, no months of siege. Instead, a combination of political pressure, military loyalty, and confusion allowed Napoleon to seize power with astonishing speed. The old government disappeared. A new one emerged. Napoleon became first consul of France. Officially, France remained a republic. In reality, one man now held more power than anyone else. He immediately began reshaping the nation. The economy stabilized. Government administration became more efficient. The education system was reorganized. Infrastructure projects expanded. Taxes became more consistent. Political order slowly returned after years of revolutionary chaos. Many French citizens welcomed these changes. After a decade of violence and uncertainty, stability felt almost revolutionary in itself. But Napoleon's ambition had not yet reached its limit. He no longer wished merely to govern France. He intended to leave a legacy that would rival Caesar and Charlemagne. Then came one of the most unforgettable ceremonies in European history. On December 2, 1804, thousands gathered inside the magnificent Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. The building shimmered with candlelight. Military officers stood beside bishops. Foreign ambassadors watched from their seats. The air was filled with expectation. Pope Pius VII had traveled all the way from Rome to witness the ceremony. Traditionally, the Pope would place the imperial crown upon the ruler's head, symbolizing that authority ultimately came from God through the Church. Everyone expected history to repeat itself. Instead, Napoleon did something no one anticipated. As the crown was presented, he reached forward, took it into his own hands, and slowly placed it upon his own head. The cathedral fell silent. The gesture lasted only a few seconds. Its meaning would echo for centuries. Napoleon was sending a message not only to France, but to every monarchy in Europe. His authority came from neither ancient dynasties nor papal blessing. He believed he had earned it himself. The young artillery officer mocked for his accent. The outsider from Corsica. The unknown soldier who once wandered military school libraries dreaming of Alexander the Great had become Emperor of the French. Yet as Europe watched the ceremony with growing alarm, few realized that Napoleon's greatest victories and his greatest mistakes still lay ahead. When Napoleon placed the imperial crown upon his own head inside Notre Dame Cathedral, he did far more than proclaim himself emperor. He challenged the entire political order of Europe. For centuries, kings had inherited their thrones through ancient bloodlines. Emperors received legitimacy through dynasties, noble families, or the blessing of the Church. Napoleon possessed none of those advantages. He was not born into one of Europe's great royal houses. He had not inherited an empire. He had built his power through talent, battlefield victories, and an extraordinary understanding of politics. To monarchs across Europe, that made him more dangerous than any invading army. Because if an unknown officer from Corsica could become emperor, what prevented others from dreaming the same dream? The answer came quickly. What? Almost immediately, Britain, Austria, Russia, and several other European powers formed a new alliance determined to destroy Napoleon before his influence spread any further. To them, France had become more than a military threat. It represented revolutionary ideas that questioned centuries of tradition. If Napoleon remained successful, the balance of power that had governed Europe for generations might disappear forever. Napoleon welcomed the challenge. He believed that speed, discipline, and careful planning could overcome armies much larger than his own. More importantly, he trusted his soldiers completely. And they trusted him. Many of the men marching beneath the imperial eagle had followed Napoleon for nearly a decade. They had crossed mountains together, survived impossible campaigns together, defeated armies that experts believed could never be beaten. By now, they no longer fought only for France. They fought for Napoleon. The defining moment came in December 1805. Near the small town of Austerlitz, in what is now the Czech Republic, Napoleon prepared to face the combined armies of Austria and Russia. Together, they outnumbered him. Many believed this would finally be the battle that ended the French Empire before it had fully begun. Napoleon wanted them to believe exactly that. For days, he deliberately appeared weaker than he really was. French soldiers abandoned certain positions, giving the impression that they were struggling to hold the battlefield. Enemy commanders interpreted these movements as signs of uncertainty. They took the bait. Before sunrise on December 2, thick fog covered the valleys surrounding the battlefield. Hidden beneath that blanket of mist, thousands of French soldiers waited silently. Napoleon had studied every hill, every road, every stream. every possible movement his enemies could make. He knew exactly where he wanted them to attack. As Austrian and Russian forces advanced toward what they believed was the weak French right flank, they unknowingly abandoned the center of their own line. That was the moment Napoleon had been waiting for. As the morning sun broke through the fog, an image that later became known as the Sun of Austerlitz, French troops surged forward with astonishing speed. The enemy center collapsed. Entire divisions found themselves cut apart from one another. Confusion spread through the Allied armies. What had begun as an organized assault quickly turned into chaos. Some soldiers fled toward frozen lakes. Others abandoned their artillery. Officers struggled desperately to restore order, but Napoleon's army moved too quickly. By the end of the day, one of Europe's largest coalitions had suffered one of its greatest defeats. Historians still consider the Battle of Austerlitz to be Napoleon's greatest military masterpiece. It demonstrated everything that made him extraordinary: patience, preparation, psychology, timing. He had not simply defeated his enemies. He had convinced them to defeat themselves. After Austerlitz, Napoleon stood at the height of his power. The Holy Roman Empire, which had existed in various forms for nearly 1,000 years, came to an end. Kings accepted French influence. New states appeared across Europe. Old borders disappeared. Members of Napoleon's own family became kings and queens of newly created kingdoms. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire continent revolved around one man. Yet Napoleon's legacy extended far beyond the battlefield. While armies marched across Europe, lawyers, administrators, engineers, and teachers quietly transformed France itself. One of Napoleon's greatest achievements was the creation of the Napoleonic Code. Unlike many legal systems that favored noble birth, the new code declared that all male citizens were equal before the law. It protected private property, standardized legal procedures, and established principles that influenced civil law across much of Europe and Latin America. Even today, many modern legal systems still reflect ideas introduced during Napoleon's reign. He reorganized education, strengthened government administration, founded the Bank of France, expanded roads and public works, improved tax collection, encouraged scientific research. In many ways, Napoleon ruled as both conqueror and reformer. But history has a way of punishing those who mistake success for invincibility. For years, Britain remained Napoleon's greatest enemy. Unable to defeat the British Navy at sea, he attempted another strategy. If Britain depended upon European trade, he would close every European port. The continental system aimed to isolate Britain economically by preventing European nations from trading with it. On paper, the plan appeared brilliant. In practice, it proved almost impossible to enforce. Smuggling flourished. Merchants ignored restrictions. Entire economies suffered. One country, however, became Napoleon's greatest concern: Russia. Tsar Alexander I gradually abandoned strict enforcement of the continental system. Trade resumed. To Napoleon, this represented more than economic disobedience. It was a challenge to his authority. In 1812, he made the decision that would destroy everything he had built. He invaded Russia. The army assembled for the campaign was unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Nearly 600,000 men from across the French Empire and its allied nations marched eastward. French soldiers, Italians, Germans, the Croats, Spaniards. Dozens of languages echoed through the camps. It was the largest military force assembled on the continent up to that time. Many believed the campaign would end as all Napoleon's campaigns had ended, with victory. Instead, the Russians refused to fight the decisive battle Napoleon wanted. Again and again they retreated. Villages were abandoned. Fields were burned. Food supplies disappeared. Every mile deeper into Russia stretched French supply lines farther and farther behind. The army continued advancing. The enemy continued withdrawing. By September, Napoleon reached Moscow. He expected negotiations. Instead, he found flames. Large sections of the city burned for days. Whether deliberately set or accidentally spread, the fires destroyed enormous quantities of food and shelter. Napoleon had captured Russia's ancient capital. But he had gained almost nothing. Winter approached. No peace offer arrived. No surrender came. At last, Napoleon ordered the retreat. It became one of history's greatest military disasters. Snow buried the roads. Temperatures fell far below freezing. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Soldiers wrapped themselves in torn blankets, desperate to survive another night. Food disappeared. Disease spread. Russian cavalry attacked constantly. Thousands died without ever seeing an enemy soldier. Some froze where they stood. Others simply lay down beside the road, too exhausted to continue. By the time the shattered remnants of the Grand Army crossed back into friendly territory, only a fraction of the original force remained. Europe finally understood. Napoleon could be defeated. One by one, the powers that had once feared him united again. Austria, Britain, within. Together they pushed steadily toward France. In 1814, Paris fell. Napoleon abdicated. The emperor who had ruled much of Europe was sent into exile on the small Mediterranean island of Elba. Most believed his story had ended. They were wrong. Less than a year later, Napoleon escaped. Landing on the French coast with only a few hundred loyal followers, he began marching toward Paris. The government sent soldiers to arrest him. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Napoleon walked alone toward the approaching troops. According to tradition, he opened his coat and declared, "If any man among you would shoot his emperor, here I am." No shots were fired. One by one, the soldiers lowered their weapons. Then they joined him. The emperor had returned. This astonishing period became known as the 100 Days. For a brief moment, history seemed willing to give Napoleon one final chance. Europe refused. The Allied powers assembled their armies once more. On June 18, 1815, near the Belgian village of Waterloo, Napoleon fought his final battle. Heavy rain had turned the fields into deep mud. Artillery became difficult to move. Infantry advanced slowly. Crucial attacks were delayed. The Duke of Wellington's British-led army held its ground longer than Napoleon expected. Then, the Prussian army arrived. French resistance collapsed. For the first time in years, Napoleon could not reverse the battle. Waterloo ended more than a military campaign. It ended an era. This time there would be no escape. The British sent Napoleon to one of the most isolated places on Earth, the remote Atlantic island of St. Helena, more than 1,000 miles from the nearest continent. No friendly army waited nearby. No loyal supporters could rescue him. There would be no second return. The man who had once ruled much of Europe spent his final years walking the island's cliffs, dictating his memories, reflecting upon victories and failures, and carefully shaping how future generations might remember him. He died there on May 5, 1821. He was 51 years old. Yet death did not end his influence. 2 centuries later, military academies across the world still study his campaigns. Governments continue using legal principles inspired by the Napoleonic Code. Historians continue debating whether he was a liberator, a tyrant, a reformer, or an ambitious conqueror who simply reached too far. Perhaps he was all of those things. He brought modern legal reforms to millions. He also led wars that cost countless lives. He spread revolutionary ideas across Europe. He also crowned himself emperor. He believed deeply in merit. Yet he built an empire centered upon his own authority. Napoleon Bonaparte remains one of history's greatest contradictions. He was not born to rule. He inherited no empire. He possessed no ancient dynasty. Only ambition, discipline, and an unshakable belief that history belonged to those willing to reshape it. The young boy mocked for his foreign accent. The lonely cadet who spent evenings reading about Alexander the Great. The unknown artillery officer who solved problems others could not. Became the man who forced an entire continent to redraw its maps. His empire eventually fell. His armies were defeated. His crown was taken away. But even after 2 centuries, the shadow of Napoleon still stretches across Europe. Because some men change battles. Some men change countries. Napoleon Bonaparte, changed history itself.